At UFC 327, Jiří Procházka will win the light heavyweight championship by brutally KOing Carlos Ulberg in devastating fashion. But before we get to the predictions for that particular fight and how it will play out, I would like to go over the entirety of the UFC 327 card from the early prelims to the main card, because while I have been critical of the Paramount era so far, this is a solid numbered card, and I'm genuinely intrigued and interested by many of the fights on it. Which is also why I'm not calling this a slop predictions video, because I'm genuinely interested, which in turn has made me go back and watch fights so I could give my predictions in greater detail. But without further ado, let's get started. Starting with the very first fight on the card, let's talk about Charles Radtke versus Francisco Prado. And in this fight, I can tell you straight up, I'm going with Charles Radtke to win by early KO. Francisco Prado is 1-4 in the UFC, and his one win is over Otman Azaitar down at lightweight back in 2023. A fighter who ended up getting cut from the UFC after getting knocked out 3 times in a row. And the losses that Francisco Prado has taken have been pretty bad, I would say. He's lost to Jamie Malarkey, who really isn't that great and is quite chinny, and he also lost to Nikolai Veretnikov, who also isn't really that good. However, the biggest stain on Francisco Prado's resume is losing to Daniel Zellhuber. And now Daniel Zellhuber, as you guys might be well aware, is the guy who ended up losing to both Michael Johnson and Bobby Green, and even got brutally finished by Bobby Green on his home turf of Mexico. And sure, there's a chance that Francisco Prado might look better up at welterweight, but I highly doubt that. In contrast, Charles Radtke has only lost to Carlos Prates and Mike Mallet, both of whom are ranked, albeit in Mike Mallet's case is kind of fraudulent, but still, those two aren't bad losses. I think Charles Radtke is going to be the far superior boxer and also the bigger submission threat. Another thing I have to add is that Charles Radtke trains with Belal Muhammad and often has Belal in his corner. And here's the thing with Belal. Say what you will about Belal Muhammad being boring or being cringe, but the thing you can't take away from Belal is he's got a pretty high fight IQ. The guy ended up becoming champion without having any finishing ability whatsoever. So if Charles Radtke has Belal Muhammad in his corner, you can be guaranteed that he's going to be receiving pretty good advice, which is just another point that makes me more confident in Charles Radtke getting this done. So yes, give me Charles Radtke by round 1 KO, and it's likely going to be something like a left hook. And hopefully after getting a KO, we get another fantastic Charles Radtke interview like the one he gave after beating Blood Diamond at UFC 293.
I'm here with Charles Radtke. Charles, how good did it feel to get your first UFC victory?
It felt great, and so fuck all you f***ings up in the crowd. Come down here and get some, you ass bitch.
Now, moving on to a fight that could have headlined a card back in 2021, but is now relegated to the early prelims, let's talk about Kelvin Gastelum versus Vicente Luque. Both of these guys are past their prime, they're both 34 years old, and who wins this fight really comes down to who is less washed. Vicente Luque is coming off of 2 losses, with one of those being to Joel Alvarez, which I don't really think is a bad loss, especially since Vicente Luque was able to survive to a decision. But then the other loss is to Kevin Holland, where Vicente Luque looked slow and he ended up just getting outstruck and subbed. Kelvin Gastelum, on the other hand, is coming off of a win over Dustin Stoltzfus, who really isn't that good, and in that fight, Kelvin missed weight up at middleweight, which is kind of crazy, since Kelvin Gastelum, he doesn't even look shredded down at welterweight. However, prior to the Dustin Stoltzfus fight, Kelvin Gastelum was able to take Joe Pyfer to decision, and Joe Pyfer just finished Israel Adesanya, albeit Dogbender is very clearly washed. And in the Joe Pyfer fight, Kelvin Gastelum survived getting dropped and hurt multiple times, so his chin and durability still are there. And this sort of leads me to believe that Kelvin Gastelum will win this fight. Since Vicente Luque is coming up from welterweight, Kelvin Gastelum is not going to be at the typical reach and height disadvantage that he has been throughout his middleweight career. And I also think that Kelvin is just going to be the less washed of these two. And you also have to factor in that Vicente Luque, back after he lost to Geoff Neal, he ended up having a brain bleed. And Luque really hasn't looked the same since. And while prime Vicente Luque had a fantastic chin, at this point, he's been finished a few times, while in contrast, Kelvin Gastelum has never been knocked out. So here is my prediction for how this fight is going to go. Kelvin Gastelum is going to show up to the weigh-ins weighing probably 3 to 4 pounds over. Kelvin Gastelum is then going to give up maybe 30 to 40% of his purse to Vicente Luque, and then win a 29-28 decision based on volume. I don't see Vicente Luque hurting Kelvin Gastelum all too badly on the feet, because Kelvin's been hurt by much more powerful punchers in the past, like Joe Pyfer and Israel Adesanya, and has survived those exchanges. And ever since that loss to Geoff Neal, Vicente Luque's output in fights has dropped significantly. So yes, I'm taking Kelvin Gastelum to win by a 30-27 or 29-28 decision, and you also have to factor in that once Kelvin Gastelum misses weight, he might end up utilizing those extra 3 to 4 pounds to wrestle Vicente Luque as well. Next, moving on up to another fight on the prelims, let's talk about MarQuel Mederos versus Chris Padilla. And now, if you were just looking at these two guys' records, you would be tempted to pick MarQuel Mederos. He's 11-1, while Chris Padilla, he's 17-6. However, if you look at the competition these two guys have been facing, you would understand that Chris Taco Padilla, is the correct choice. MarQuel Mederos, he's 3-0 in the UFC, but all of his wins have been by decision, including a split decision win over Austin Hubbard, who really isn't all that good and ended up getting cut from the UFC afterwards. And in contrast, Chris Padilla, he's finished guys like Ismail Bonfim and Rongju, who are not great, but they're alright. They're not terrible, okay? Like Ismail Bonfim, he's the guy that got that highlight reel KO against Terrence McKinney with a flying knee. And Chris Padilla dominated him and finished him pretty easily. And Ismail Bonfim missed weight for that fight. So yes, I'm picking Chris Padilla because he's been fighting slightly better competition and he's been finishing them as opposed to MarQuel Mederos, who's been fighting what I wouldn't even consider to be UFC level competition and taking them to a decision. So I will be picking Chris Taco Padilla to win this fight by a 29-28 decision. Now, moving on up the card, we have Tatiana Suarez versus Lupita Godinez. Now, I was one of the guys who was dumb enough to pick Tatiana Suarez to beat Zhang Weili because, she has the wrestling pedigree and all of that. But I think I'm pretty safe in picking Tatiana Suarez to beat Lupita Godinez here. Lupita Godinez is not a finisher in any sense of the word. In contrast, Tatiana Suarez, she actually is able to finish women at women's strawweight, which it's worth something, right? I don't think Suarez is going to finish Lupita Godinez, but I think she'll win a comfortable decision using her wrestling, maybe threaten a guillotine choke at one point or another, and end up winning this fight on points. So yes, give me Tatiana Suarez probably by 30-27 decision, using her wrestling and her grappling and her submission attempts. And look, Tatiana Suarez, she lost to Zhang Weili. There's no shame in doing that. In contrast, Lupita Godinez, well, she's kind of hit or miss. Like, we don't know which version of Lupita Godinez is going to show up to this fight, and I'm guessing it's going to be a version that Tatiana Suarez is going to be able to dominate. And now, moving on to what everybody thinks is going to be an underrated banger, but I personally think is going to be incredibly boring. Let's talk about Mateusz Gamrot versus Esteban Ribovics, and I'm just going to tell you straight up, I see no way that Mateusz Gamrot loses this fight. And it all just comes down to wrestling diff. Throughout his entire UFC run so far, Esteban Ribovics has only been fighting strikers. Elvis Brenner, striker. Nasrat Haqparast, striker. Daniel Zellhuber, striker. The closest that Esteban Ribovics has gotten to fighting a grappler was Terrence McKinney, and Esteban Ribovics ended that fight before McKinney can get any sort of grappling offense off. And here's the other thing with Esteban Ribovics. Ribovics is a high-volume striker, but he is quite pillow-fisted. The KO win against Terrence McKinney was by a head kick, and if you look at his run throughout the UFC so far, he's really struggled to hurt anybody with his hands. Sure, he wobbled Daniel Zellhuber pretty badly in their fight, and Daniel Zellhuber, he got finished by old Unk Bobby Green. I just highly doubt that Esteban Ribovics will be able to hurt Mateusz Gamrot in any sort of significant way. And then, if you look at things on Mateusz Gamrot's end, he has fought guys like Esteban Ribovics, most notably Ludovic Klein. And in that fight, Mateusz Gamrot was able to consistently secure takedowns and land ground and pound. And the relentless wrestling offense from Gamrot left Ludovic Klein completely unable to find his rhythm on the feet. Esteban Ribovics is at his best when he's allowed to keep the fight standing and get into his flow state. And I just don't think that Mateusz Gamrot is going to give him that opportunity. He's completely untested against any wrestlers in the UFC, let alone a wrestler of Gamrot's caliber. who famously went tit for tat in the wrestling against Arman Tsarukyan. And even when it comes to the stand-up, Mateusz Gamrot was hurting guys like Dan Hooker on the feet. So frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if these guys hit exactly as hard as each other. And when you factor in the threat of the takedown, I could honestly see Mateusz Gamrot outstriking Esteban Ribovics when they're on the feet. But honestly, the wrestling gap between these two guys is going to be so big that I'm not even factoring in the stand-up that much. I think Mateusz Gamrot is going to submit Esteban Ribovics. And now that might sound a little bit crazy, but I think it's totally within the realm of possibility. So yes, my prediction for this fight is Mateusz Gamrot to win by submission in the first or second round, likely with an arm triangle or a darce. I think Gamrot is going to get down Esteban Ribovics with ease, and then when Esteban Ribovics tries to wrestle up, I think that Gamrot is going to snatch up his neck and submit him. And if he doesn't do that, well, we're probably going to end up getting the typical Mateusz Gamrot 30-27 wrestling control performance. Either way, it's going to be either anticlimactic, where Mateusz Gamrot just takes him down and subs him, or it's going to be kind of boring, where Mateusz Gamrot takes him down and controls him. Now, moving on to the second to last prelim, let's talk about Kevin Holland versus Randy Brown. And well, this fight is between two sort of similar fighters. Both Randy Brown and Kevin Holland are long, lanky strikers who are both incredibly tall for the welterweight division. They also both lose to Drew Dober, but anyways. In this fight, I'm picking Randy Brown. And now, that might seem like a strange pick at first, because out of these two fighters, Randy Brown is definitely the less durable fighter. Kevin Holland has never been knocked out, by which I mean he's never been knocked out cold. He does have KO losses on his record, but those were both due to injuries. Randy Brown, on the other hand, got chinned in his last fight against Gabriel Bonfim, got KO'd by Vicente Luque back in the day, got dropped and then choked out by Jack Della Maddalena, and most infamously, got basically fluke KO'd by Nico Price with hammer fist from bottom. However, despite all of that, and the fact that Randy Brown is older than Kevin Holland, is that I just cannot trust Kevin Holland to take a fight seriously. I just cannot trust him to go for the win. Kevin Holland looked really bad in his last fight against Daniel Rodriguez, where he got dropped by a very old and very washed D-Rod. Both Kevin Holland and Randy Brown are sort of reliant on using their length and their frame to sort of outrange and bully the smaller welterweights. And since both of these guys are going to be roughly the same size, it's likely going to become a tit-for-tat striking match at range. And if that is to happen, I can totally see Kevin Holland getting unfocused, zoning out, and goofing off in the middle of the octagon after not finding an early finish. So yes, my prediction for this fight is going to be Randy Brown by points. I think Kevin Holland is going to win the first round, but then Randy Brown is just going to outstrike Kevin Holland at range, maybe land a few extra jabs, and outpoint Kevin Holland in the second and third. And yes, I would have totally picked Kevin Holland to actually win this fight a few years ago. It's just that I can't trust him to be mentally there. At least with Randy Brown, I can be sure that he really, truly wants to win, which can't be said for Holland. And now, moving on up to the featured prelim, let's talk about the most Bellator fight to have ever Bellatored. It's Patricio Pitbull versus Aaron Pico. And well, this is my first major underdog pick for the card, but I am going with Patricio. And it all just comes down to this. Aaron Pico does not have a chin. As I discussed in my video on the worst chins in the UFC, Aaron Pico is the very definition of a glass cannon. Pico is a frightening power puncher. But man, the guy just cannot take a shot to save his life. Patricio Pitbull is old. However, he's still somewhat durable. I mean, if you look at the Yair Rodriguez fight, he got dropped, but he didn't get finished. If Aaron Pico ate that same shot from Yair, I think he would just go out cold. Pitbull is very difficult to finish. He's more defensively responsible, and even though he is old, you have to remember that the last thing that goes for a fighter on the decline is his power. In a firefight between Patricio and Aaron Pico, I would pick Patricio to win that, and that's because, while Pico is going to land more volume, it only takes one punch from Patricio Pitbull to flatten Aaron Pico. When you have Aaron Pico's chin, everybody that you're fighting is Ilia Topuria. And if you look at Patricio's last fight, he was hurting Dan Ige, and Dan Ige is pretty hard to hurt. And while Aaron Pico, he could mix in his wrestling to outmuscle old washed Patricio, Patricio is a short, stocky guy for the division, and his takedown defense is pretty solid. So yes, in this fight, I will be picking Patricio Pitbull to win as an underdog by KO in the first or second round. I think Pico is going to be putting the pressure on early with his wrestling and his boxing, and he might even get close to finishing Patricio at points. But then there's just going to come a point where Patricio wings a left hook or throws a right straight and just flattens Pico. And now moving on to the fight on the main card, we've got two old unks going at it in Cub Swanson versus Nate Landwehr. And in this fight as well, I'm picking the older fighter in Cub Swanson to win. And really, this is more of a vibes pick than anything, but I really just do think that Cub Swanson is going to out-unk Nate Landwehr. Throughout his career, Cub Swanson has fought incredibly high-level competition. He's coming off of a KO win against Billy Quarantillo, and in contrast, Nate Landwehr, he's coming off of 2 KO losses. I think Cub Swanson is the more defensively responsible striker, and while this fight is likely going to take place 100% on the feet, I think that Cub Swanson is also the superior grappler. And I really don't have a lot to say about this fight. I just think that Cub is going to get it done. Cub Swanson has faced and beaten fighters who are much better than Nate Landwehr, albeit that was a long time ago, but still, the experience is there. The technique is there. And I don't think that 37-year-old Nate Landwehr is going to have a significant athleticism advantage over Cub Swanson. So yes, I'll be picking Cub Swanson to win this fight by KO or TKO, probably in the second or third round. And now, moving on to a fight between two fighters who just absolutely have no chins, let's talk about Dominick Reyes versus Johnny Walker. And now, the obvious prediction for this fight is to predict it to go to a draw due to a double KO. But since you really can't do that, I'll be going with Dominick Reyes to win this. Dominick Reyes is going to have the speed advantage, he's going to be much more technical on the feet. Johnny Walker is definitely the more powerful of the two. However, he just doesn't have the technique to deliver the power. Broadly speaking, Johnny Walker fights in one of two styles. Either he fights on the back foot, throwing leg kicks in a capital T technical way, like he did in the Anthony Smith fight, where he's just trying to outpoint his opponent. And then the other way that he fights is just going for it recklessly in a quite uncoordinated way, and just getting chinned in the end. And since Dominick Reyes, he is mainly a back foot fighter who is really reliant on that step back left straight counter, I think that Johnny Walker is going to fight in the latter way, the flailing forwards way. And that's where I think Dominick Reyes is going to catch him. Whenever Johnny Walker KOs somebody, it's with something fluky. He KO'd Paul Craig with hammer fists. He finished Zhang Mingyang with calf kicks that just hurt Zhang a lot more than anybody expected. In contrast, you can kind of rely on Dominick Reyes to be landing the left hand. And in these sorts of fights, where both guys have no chin, I'm going to pick the guy who has the more reliable finishing weapon. And that is Dominick Reyes. So yes, my official prediction for this fight is Dominick Reyes by round 1 or 2 KO or TKO with a step back left hand while Johnny Walker kind of lumbers in. And now moving on to the featured fight, let's talk about Curtis Blaydes versus Josh Hokit. And look, this is a massive step up in competition for Josh Hokit. He only has one win in the UFC. However, I am going to be picking him. And the reason why all comes down to a single word: speed. Josh Hokit is incredibly fast for a heavyweight. And that's probably just because he's a natural middleweight. He's only 185 centimeters tall and only weighs 106.4 kilograms, which is 6'1" and 234.5 pounds for all of you barbarians who don't use metric measurements. Curtis Blaydes is going to have a huge size, frame, and reach advantage against Josh Hokit. However, I just think that Josh Hokit is going to be too fast for him. Since both Curtis Blaydes and Josh Hokit are wrestlers, this fight is likely going to end up taking place on the feet. And I don't know how to describe it, but Josh Hokit, he's like a bouncy dough ball. His footwork is genuinely incredibly good for a heavyweight, and I think he's simply going to dance circles around Curtis Blaydes as Blaydes plods after him trying to counter him. Curtis Blaydes did not look good in his last fight against Rizvan Kuniev, and while Rizvan Kuniev, he is a steroid cheat, but he was likely off of steroids in that fight. And Curtis Blaydes arguably lost that fight, so that's not a good look. My official prediction for this fight is going to be Josh Hokit to win by decision. And the way that I think it's going to pan out is Curtis Blaydes is going to plod after Josh Hokit as Josh Hokit dances around the outside of the octagon, landing jabs, landing low kicks, and just outpointing Curtis Blaydes with his speed advantage. There will be times when Curtis Blaydes shoots for takedowns, but Josh Hokit will simply stuff them or simply just create distance using his footwork. There's also a significant chance that Josh Hokit chins Curtis Blaydes with something like a blitzing 1-2. Since Curtis Blaydes, he doesn't have a terrible chin, but he doesn't have a truly elite chin for a heavyweight. And Curtis Blaydes, he's also not a power puncher for a heavyweight either. Sure, he finished Jailton Almeida with hammer fists, but that's Jailton Almeida, a guy who is notorious for basically having no fighting spirit whatsoever. So yes, my official prediction for this fight is going to be Josh Hokit by 30-27 decision, where he just outpoints Curtis Blaydes at range, landing jabs, landing straight right hands, and landing low kicks. And one other thing I'm taking into consideration for this fight is that the heavyweight division is in desperate need of fresh contenders. So if this fight ends up going to a close decision, the UFC is going to give the win to Josh Hokit. I mean, the very fact that they're giving him this sort of step up in the first place is all that you need to know with how much they're putting behind Hokit. So yes, give me Josh Hokit by decision. And now moving on to the co-main event, we have Mr. Secret Juice versus Mr. Very, very, very publicly on juice in Paulo Costa versus Azamat Murzakanov. Now, please take a good look at these two guys' physiques and guess which one was the one who tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs twice. And well, in this fight, I'll be picking the confirmed steroid cheat over the clean guy. Give me Azamat Murzakanov, and here's why. Azamat Murzakanov is a short, stocky guy for light heavyweight, and honestly, he's so small that I wouldn't be surprised if he could cut down to not just middleweight, but welterweight. However, because he is so much smaller and lighter than everybody else, he has a significant speed advantage over most of his competition. And while Paulo Costa will have a significant size advantage over Azamat Murzakanov, despite being the guy who is moving up, Azamat Murzakanov just knocked out Alexander Rakic, who is a heavyweight-sized fighter. However, I do expect that this fight will be rather close, and here's why. Paulo Costa is incredibly effective against southpaws, and that's because Paulo Costa, his favorite weapons are the right body kick and the right high kick. And Paulo Costa demonstrated this in his fight against Roman Kopylov, where he was able to bully Kopylov using his size and his strength and the power on those kicks. Azamat Murzakanov, well, he is mainly a southpaw fighter, and that's why Paulo Costa, he's likely going to be able to bully Azamat early on with those kicks. However, with Azamat Murzakanov, I think that he is skilled and technical enough to be able to deal with Paulo's lumbering offense. Like, the guy hasn't lost for a reason, okay? Despite being a steroid cheat, the guy is a very technical fighter and does have a pretty high fight IQ. So, don't be surprised if Azamat Murzakanov decides to come into this fight and start fighting orthodox instead of southpaw. And that's why my prediction for this fight is going to be Azamat Murzakanov to win by decision. I think he's going to outpoint Costa by fighting on the outside while Paulo Costa sort of lumbers after him. Azamat Murzakanov is very fast, he's very explosive, and while Paulo Costa does pressure a lot, he's not very good at cutting the cage. And that's just going to let Azamat dance around at range, landing straight shots. So yes, I'll be picking Azamat Murzakanov to win by probably a 29-28 or 30-27 decision. I doubt that Murzakanov would be able to finish Paulo Costa because Paulo Costa is incredibly durable, but I think he'll just tit-for-tat outpoint him at range. That's how I see this fight going. And now, we move on to the main event. Jiří Procházka versus Carlos Ulberg for the vacant light heavyweight title. And as I said at the very beginning of this video, Jiří Procházka will destroy Carlos Ulberg. And that's not just because I'm glazing Jiří, because he is a Rizin fighter. And by the way, right after this UFC card ends, there's going to be Rizin Landmark 13, which you should definitely check out, by the way. But it's also because Carlos Ulberg, he just doesn't respond well to being pressured. And pressure is what Jiří does. The number one reason I'm picking Jiří Procházka to win this fight by KO or TKO are Carlos Ulberg's fights against Jan Blachowicz and Volkan Oezdemir. In both of those fights, Carlos Ulberg just kind of backed up while throwing low kicks. And in both of those fights, he really didn't hurt either one of them with his low kicks. And I mean, his low kicks were so tippy-tappy that even though he outlanded Jan Blachowicz, there were many people including myself, who thought that he lost against Jan Blachowicz, and that's because Jan was landing the harder low kicks. Carlos Ulberg does throw a lot of low kicks, and Jiří Procházka does struggle with checking them. However, are they incredibly damaging low kicks like the ones that Alex Pereira landed on Jiří? Likely not. They're probably going to be more like Alexander Rakic's low kicks against Jiří, which really didn't hurt Jiří at all. And a large reason why Carlos Ulberg struggles to get power behind those kicks is because he's always going backwards when he's throwing them. And you can be basically guaranteed that Ulberg will be going backwards against Jiří. Sure, there will likely be some standing exchanges in the middle of the octagon as Jiří starts to get into his flow and get into his rhythm. But I just genuinely don't know how Carlos Ulberg is going to hurt Jiří Procházka with any of his shots. I genuinely believe that once Carlos Ulberg and Jiří Procházka are in the octagon, what's going to happen is Carlos Ulberg is going to throw a few low kicks, he's going to throw a few jabs. However, Jiří's just going to be there and he's going to keep on coming after him. And that pressure is going to make Carlos Ulberg break in front of our eyes. And another reason why I say this is because for Carlos Ulberg, fighting is a second choice. He's a former rugby player and a former TV show contestant who also works part-time as a model. He's just not as locked in as Jiří Procházka. He just doesn't have the same level of warrior spirit. And while you might think that I'm just memeing when I say that, a large part of fighting is mental. And that's where I think Jiří's main edge is. Ever since Carlos Ulberg got knocked out by Kennedy Nzechukwu, which is a terrible loss in retrospect by the way, he has always been fighting on the back foot. Jiří Procházka, he got knocked out by Alex Pereira twice, and he still went to war with Jamal Hill and Khalil Rountree Jr. Jiří is not afraid to get into a firefight. Carlos Ulberg is. Jiří is not afraid to go forward. Carlos Ulberg is. Carlos Ulberg wants to keep this fight capital T technical. Jiří Procházka is going to go in there and cause chaos. So yes, give me Jiří Procházka to win this fight by KO or TKO in the 3rd or 4th round. I think it will be brutal, incredibly devastating, and I don't think Carlos Ulberg will ever recover from this loss. In fact, I can see Carlos Ulberg retiring after what Jiří does to him. And that's because the will to win, the warrior spirit between these two guys is just different. And oh yeah, Carlos Ulberg just happens to be 2 years older than Jiří, by the way, so, Jiří is going to have the younger man's athleticism. And the final point that makes me more confident in Jiří Procházka's chances is, although both of these guys are strikers, even if Carlos Ulberg is to knock Jiří Procházka down, Jiří can grapple. Carlos Ulberg is a pure striker. Jiří Procházka, on the other hand, well, he submitted Glover Teixeira. He took down Alex Pereira. His grappling is somewhat underrated. So even if Carlos Ulberg stings Jiří on the feet, Jiří can clinch up. Jiří can shoot for takedowns. The only way Carlos Ulberg wins this fight is by flatlining Jiří Procházka, and frankly, I don't think he's going to have the power to do so. So, Jiří will win, and we will get even more goated title fights at light heavyweight in the future. But anyways, those are all of my predictions for UFC 327, and as a final note, please tell Fight Society that I'm incredibly jealous of him because he's now being paid by Rizin to shill for them when I've been doing it for free. Please put the hashtag #CuckedByFightSociety in the comments if you've gotten to this point in the video. Goodbye.